welcome everyone to this year's Journal of Narrative Theory Dialogue. I'm Beth Currans from Women's and Gender Studies, and I'm here to introduce the event as well as our first speaker. The Journal of Narrative Theory, or JNT, is an international cultural studies journal that is published by the English department here at EMU, and it has two editors, including the fabulous Abby Kuykendall, who organized tonight's event, and the equally fabulous Craig Dion. And tonight there will be two speakers. The first is José Muñoz, and the second will be Samuel Chip Delany. And that will be followed by the dialogue between these two speakers as well as everyone here. So as they're speaking, please keep in mind questions you have to help have that be a real dialogue between all of us. And we will have mics that can move around for you to ask questions. And then afterwards, if you want to continue talking about the queer commons, which is our theme, you can join all of us for a reception outside of the art gallery. And for those who don't know where it is, it's in room 210, which if you go up this way will be over to my right, your left, and you'll just see people up there. Also for students, if you're wanting LBC credit, there's a way to do that. We have a pad up here that someone will be passing around at some point. So just sign up with your name, your e-number, and we will give you LBC credit for being here. And so then now I will introduce our first speaker. And I'm very honored to introduce José Muñoz, who's one of the key figures in what is now a pretty firmly established but still growing area that we call queer of color critique. And he's also an important theorist of Latinidad, or the exploration of Latina and Latino lives and culture. And I'm very excited to be introducing him tonight because his work has actually profoundly affected my thinking. And I first encountered his book in 1999 called Disidentifications, his first book. The subtitle of that is Queers of Color and the Performance of Politics. And after that, he was publishing a series of articles about affect theory, which I'm sure some of you have encountered, particularly about the idea of what it might mean to feel brown. And the culmination of that is a forthcoming book called Sense of Brown, which will be out soon. And in between that time, though, he also published a book called Cruising Utopia, The Then and There of Queer Futurity. He's also co-edited special editions of journals, other books, and blogs as part of the Bully Bloggers. So if you're interested in blog culture, you might check that out. For me, his work is really important for a number of reasons. First, he really emphasizes the importance of intersectional analysis. And so in his case, particularly bringing together race, sexuality, but also other aspects of our identities, including gender, national location, language, immigration status. But also, for me, it's important the way he addresses the complexity of race in the US, as well as his analysis of the creative responses to both homophobia and racism that queer artists of color make. And I think, for me, one of the most important things is in the process he really models interdisciplinary thinking and writing. So his work consists in intersectional analysis that addresses race, sexuality, gender, class, language, and national origin is not only important but actually necessary, given the neoliberal, heteronormative, and xenophobic nature of current US culture. His particular mode of intervention also reminds us that the black-white racial dynamic, which if race is even recognized in the US, we usually think of it in terms of black-white binary. And he reminds us that that ignores a lot of people. And in the process, I think that helps us understand race in a way that also complicates what race means for those of us who might fit easily into one of those two categories. But I guess, as I said before, the thing that may be the most important for me is as an interdisciplinary scholar who actively crosses the often rigidly defended boundary between the humanities and social sciences, I find it really hard to find people who I can kind of take with me on my travels. And in fact, Muñoz's work is been one of my most constant companions in moving into spaces that are sometimes very humanities-oriented conversations like this, or qualitative social science spaces. And for me, that's not really because he breaks disciplinary boundaries, but in fact because his work refuses to even acknowledge that these boundaries that scholars often create between, say, critical race, queer, and feminist theories, or between autoethnography, textual analysis, thick description, political commentary, and theory production. He easily moves between all of these things. He's also a fantastic writer. So if you haven't had a chance to look at his works, please do. And for me, one of his chapters or articles always leads me on a compellingly narrated journey with stops in a variety of locations, including perhaps a memory from his childhood, a performance at a queercore bar, an art exhibit, an experimental film, or even a poem. So I'm really looking forward to see what journey he wants to take us on tonight in his talk, The Brown Commons, A Sense of Wildness.
Hello. Hi, welcome. I wanted to thank Beth for that wonderful introduction. Very welcoming. I want to thank Abby for inviting me, thinking of me in this context, and driving me around today, and like getting my paper printed. And, like, there's so many things that happened. It's really a pleasure to be here. Can everyone hear me? Is this working? Yeah. Okay. I can't even express how honored I am to share a stage with Samuel Delany, whose work I find not only inspiring but energizing and provoking in all the best ways. So I'm really a little beside myself to share a stage with him. This paper has two sections. One is a kind of theoretical provocation, and then there's an example. And Abby's gonna tell me if I go too long. Okay, because I hate going long. The Brown Commons, the sense of wildness. Brown Commons is meant to signify at least two things. One is the commons of brown people, places, feelings, sounds, animals, minerals, and other objects. How these things are brown, or what makes them brown, is partially the way in which they suffer and strive together, but also the commonality of their ability to flourish under duress and pressure. They are brown in part because they've been devalued by the world outside their commons. Their brownness can be known by tracking the ways that global and local forces constantly attempt to degrade them and diminish their vitality. But they're also brown insofar as they smolder with life and persistence. They are brown because brown is the common color shared by a commons that is of and for the multitude. This is the other sense of brown I wish to describe. People and things in the commons I'm rendering are brown because they share an organicism that is not solely the organic of the natural as much as it is a certain brownness, which is an embeddedness in a vast and pulsating social world. Again, not organic like self-sufficient organism, but organic in the world, organic in the way the world is brown, and objects within the world touch and are co-present. The Brown Commons is not about the production of the individual, but instead about a movement, a flow, an impulse to move beyond the singular beyond singular individualized subjectivities. It's about the swerve of matter, organic and otherwise, the moment of contact, the encounter, and all it can generate. Brownness is nothing like continuous. It's a being with, being alongside. The story I'm telling about a sense of brown is not about the formation of atomized brown subjects, but instead about the task, the endeavor of enacting not enacting a brown commons. I'm going to read that sentence over again. I'm sorry. The story I'm telling about a sense of brown is not about the endeavor of. I'm sorry. The sentence is. Okay, the story I'm telling about a sense of brown is not about the formation of atomized brown subjects, but instead about the task, the endeavor of not enacting a brown commons, but instead about knowing brownness, that is our commonality. Furthermore, the brownness we share is not knowable in advance. Brownness is not reducible to one object or thing, so the commons of brownness is not identifiable as any particular thing we have in common. While I'm narrating an expansive brown commons that traverses the regime of the human, the politics that organize this thought experiment are primarily attached to the lives of human actants in larger social ensembles. I'm drawn to the idea of a brown commons because it captures the way in which brown people's very being is always a being in common. The brown commons is made of feelings, sounds, buildings, neighborhoods, environments, the non-human organic life that might circulate in such environments alongside humans, the inorganic presences that life is so often attached to. But first and foremost, I mean brown as in brown people in a very immediate way. In this sense, people who are rendered brown by their personal or familial participation in south to north migration patterns. I'm also thinking of people who are brown by way of accents and linguistic orientations that convey a certain difference. I mean a brownness that is conferred by the ways in which one's spatial coordinates are contested, the ways in which one's right to residency is challenged by those who make false claims to nativity. Also think of brownness in relationship to everyday customs and styles of living that connote a sense of illegitimacy. Brown indexes a certain vulnerability to the violence of property, finance, and capital's overarching mechanisms of domination. Also think of brown by law, insofar as even those who can claim legal belonging are still increasingly vulnerable to profiling and other straight practices of subordination. People who are brown in their vulnerability to the contempt and scorn of xenophobes, racists, and a class of people who are accustomed to savagely imposing their will on others. Non-human brownness is only partially knowable to us through the screen of human perception. But then, everything I'm describing as being brown is only partially knowable. To think about brownness is to accept that it arrives to us. We attune to it only partially. Pieces resist knowing and being knowable. At best, we can be attuned to what brownness does in the world, the performativity of brownness, and the sense of the world such performances engender. But we know that some humans are brown in that they feel differently. Things are brown in that they radiate a different kind of affect. Affect, as I'm employing it in this project, is meant to address a sense of being in common as it is transmitted across people, place, space. Brown affect traverses the rhythmic spacings between those singularities that compose the plurality of the commons. My use of brown is certainly a homage to the history of brown power in this country that was born out of insurrectionist student movements. I don't mean brown like in the way in which the media pundits pronounce the browning of America in relationship to electoral politics. I'm reaching back and invoking the sense of brown that was the Chicano walkouts of 1968, brown as in brown berets. Turning to the past in this particular fashion makes the point that the world is not becoming brown, but has been brown. The brown power movement followed black power and was joined by red power, gay power, and other movements for liberation. They were movements that attempted to articulate a refusal of dominant logics and systems of thought, and an insistence on thinking and doing otherwise. This movement was intimately linked to modes of knowledge production and institutional practices that would ultimately congeal as ethnic, Latino, or Chicano studies. As the case of book banning in Arizona shows us, The fact that the potential and force of brownness is intimately linked to the production of knowledge is not something that escapes the notice of enemies of brown life. Draconian immigration laws that are springing up all over the country after the passage of Arizona's SD 1070 have been shadowed by simultaneous legislation that have targeted the production of ethnic studies knowledge. While it should go without saying, it nonetheless bears repeating that attacks on ethnic studies and the knowledge it produces are also violent assaults on brown life. Fortunately, brown thought flows through the channels of what Fred Moten calls the undercommons of the academy. While official curriculums and itineraries for learning are vulnerable to those who would drive them underground, brown practices of thought will and always have thrived in the realms of the intramural, the unofficial, and the fugitive. A brown commons is constitutive of various struggles to imagine and enact a particularity that is not always salient as coterminous with plurality. Jean-Luc Nancy's notion of a being singular plural, as I will suggest, is central to my understanding of the nature of this commons. A brown commons, as I articulate it, would share some similarities with what political theorist Jane Bennett calls a grand concordance of things. Yet I do have some hesitations with the assemblage theories that so much of Bennett's work calls upon. I contend that the commons, even one as revisionary as the one I'm describing, is not an assemblage. Commons are never placid. Life in the commons is and should be turbulent, not only because of the various enclosures that attempt to overwhelm a commons, but because disagreement within the commons, what Jacques Rancière would call dissensus, is of vital importance to the augmentation of the insurrectionist promise of the commons. The brown commons is under siege. The brown commons is a political economy of social relations. Brown commons are human, non-human collectives that are, in Bennett's words, after John Dewey, provoked into existence by shared experience of harm. Brown commons are queer ecologies as well, insofar as they are not ecologies that are dependent on nature, which does not mean that they exclude nature. The queer ecology, which is the brown commons, includes the organic and the inorganic. Brown, it's important to mention, is not only the shared experience of harm between people and things, it's also the potential for the refusal and the resistance to that often systemic harm. Brownness is a kind of uncanny persistence in the face of distressed conditions of possibility. The ontomaterialist mapping of brownness and a brown commons my larger project is putting forth is not meant to displace more traditional and even realist mappings of politics. My aim is instead calibrated to supplement these models with a different kind of attunement, meant to measure the immeasurable between us, to calculate the incalculability of our singularities that never collapse into each other, but importantly touch. The commons is an old idea in the history of politics and philosophy. It's often been used as a stand-in for nature and the ways in which it is subsumed by the enclosures of private property. In Book 5 of the Republic, Plato describes a proto-communism of the simultaneous mine, not mine, which reimagines relationality through a recast notion of kinship. Aristotle, in Book 2 of the Politics, upholds the idea of a traditional polis by saying the blood of cousins is stronger in his idea of the polis than bloodlines between father and son in the Republic. For thinkers like Locke and Rousseau, the commons eventually gives way to the formation of society, progress in history being fenced off as private property. Michael Hart and Antonio Negri have suggested a new commons, after Foucault, a biopolitical commons. Hart and Negri's rewiring of the commons includes what they describe as an urban commons, or as they put it, a common in the metropolis. They say the city is not just a built environment, an object of capitalist consumption, but it is a living dynamic of cultural practices intellectual circuits, affective networks, and social institutions. I therefore see the city not just as an enclosure of nature, but as its own common that is teeming with the potentiality of a kind of living otherwise that a full engagement with the commons can help actualize. One question I've encountered while describing why I insist on calling this common brown, I've encountered various questions. The short answer to why is that the world is brown and has been, despite the various blockages that keep us from knowing or being attuned to the brownness of the world. This is to argue that lives are organized and disorganized by harsh asymmetries that systemically devalue classes of singularities, in this case, onto particularities that adhere to a shared sense of a brown or browned world. Here we can consider John Dewey and that shared sense of harm that collates the experience of people and things as belonging to a commons that is brought into being by what Spinoza would call a shared affect of indignation that can potentially lead to a thinking and analysis that would help assemble a self-conscious and potentially insurrectionist commons. Yet it's important to add that the commons I'm sketching here is articulated as a brown commons for the point of describing not only a shared indignation, but also a process of thinking, imagining, and being otherwise in the face of a shared wounding. It was Leon Trotsky who famously said, "Active indignation is linked with hope." This hope is what I've called a critical hope or an educated desire. It's an affective refusal and a salient demand for something else. Critical utopianism is not born of complacency, of an idle wishing for things to get better. It's born of the sense of indignation one feels at the harm that is visited upon humans, individuals, cultures, ways of life, the planet itself. This hope is what I've called a critical utopianism. I understand what I've been discussing. This idea of a brown commons is I've been discussing it in a somewhat unmoored fashion. I now want to link these ruminations to an example that helped me see and visualize the complexity and profundity of the commons. Wu Fang's film Wildness from last year, 2012, tells a tale of an art project that attempts to catalyze what I would call a brown commons within the metropolis. Wildness resists many of the protocols of realist documentary. It narrates the story of Los Angeles' Silver Platter, a long-standing Latino gay bar that catered to the local gay community and featured old-school transvestite performers. Sang and a group of other younger queer of color punks and artists took over the bar's less populated Tuesday night slot and hosted a party that featured edgy queer performances. The documentary tells the story of the Silver Platter through interviews with the bar's proprietors, regular patrons, and those who would become Tuesday night's denizens. The film includes talking heads, performance documentation, but also attends to a larger urban ecology that surrounds the bar, including adjacent histories of anti-immigrant and queer violence. Wildness also features the bar itself as a speaking persona who narrates the ebbs and flows of brown life that traverse its walls. The film opens with shots of LA streets and traffic, not the glamorous Los Angeles of television and movies, but the Los Angeles of workaday life. The opening visual is shot from a car. Streets are lined with minor plots of commercial space. Small businesses fill out strip malls. The seeming ubiquitous donut shops of Los Angeles' East Side. A blue neon sign announces carnitas over a restaurant. I'm going to show you the beginning of that film right now. If this all works, which is always an if. Okay, cancel that. Right? That looks pretty good so far, okay?
estado y lo cambia todo. Rostros, relaciones y vecindarios. Ya no quedan muchos como yo. Y me pregunto, ¿qué será de mí? ¿Cómo explicar mi legado? Soy un faro guiando a mis crías fuera de la oscuridad. Este cuento es uno de esos viajes, contado por el más pequeño de mis hijos, Wu, y el wildness que ellos trajeron. I'll never forget the first time I walked in. I never wanted to leave.
Chale, tócate una rola pa' Chucho Pons. Pero pues ese güey no toca. Y enséñale que esto sí es tambor. Silba, 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 silba. Y como dice Vicente Mesa, si te duele, pues sómate. Silba, 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 silba. David Huerta, la ballena del Sambo.
Me llaman Silverplatter. Les he estado sirviendo en esta misma esquina por medio siglo. Miles de criaturas han llegado en busca de mí. Los protejo con un chaleco plateado antibalas contra la ignorancia, el miedo y el odio del mundo exterior. Les doy vida, y la vida hay que vivirla.
Mi nombre es Karen, soy de México, tengo 20 años. Me siento tan orgullosa de ser transexual.
Me llamo Jessica Rodríguez.
Soy Jenny.
Marisela.
Vicky.
Mónica Ló.
Jackie, soy cubana.
Soy de Michoacán.
Colima.
De Guanajuato.
Tengo 15 años viviendo aquí, muy contenta, muy agradecida con Dios por estar en este país, de grandes oportunidades.
Mucha gente dice que este lugar es un poquito diferente, pero por eso yo me siento así a gusto, porque me siento como si estuviera en México.
Hay quienes no les gusta el lugar, pero tenemos que acoplarnos, pero las personas que he invitado, especialmente personas del ambiente lesbiano, les gusta el lugar.
I'm an old bitch. 55 years old, baby.
Porque yo me parezco al Piruri.
Las chicas son perfectas, los hombres son perfectos.
Me dan para mis gastos que son demasiados costosos y pues me la paso bien. Me gusta sentirme que me traten como una mujer y me pongo borracha y escandalosa.
Mira, nos está viendo la doña, ¿eh?
Sí.
Doña, véngase para acá, Norita.
Y yo cuando entré la primera vez aquí me cautivó. Tenía yo 17 años. Cuando mi esposo vino a ver a su hermano y yo me quedé afuera. Y dije, ay, yo quiero entrar ahí. Y pues muy bonito, sentí una emoción bien grande. Y siempre me gustó estar acá. Me dice, ¿qué es una mujer como tú en un mundo tan extraño? Bueno, le digo, extraño para mí no. tal vez ante tus ojos se vea extraño, pero me siento muy identificada con ellos en algo, pero no en lo físico, en los sentimientos, por dentro de uno.
I have to stop that. Sorry, at 5 minutes and I'm wrapping up. So I'm going to talk through a little bit of the end of the paper. I go on to describe what the film is about, which is really the conflict between the Tuesday night party wildness and that was by the younger kind of punk artist kids and the regulars, right? And there was and it wasn't as easy as a conflict. Some of the regulars loved the infusion of the younger folks from different race and class backgrounds, while others were resistant to it. So I talk about that kind of turbulence as being a turbulence that is like endemic to the commons, right? A kind of disagreement that is central. Then I talk about a moment in Althusser when he talks about the very nature of matter itself as being about a swerve, what he calls the clinamen, after Lucretius, and the kind of encounter when atoms collide. I compare that to the theory of contact that Samuel Delany describes in his very important Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. And I talk about this kind of how a commons is always about this kind of unsteadiness, right? So here's the ending. In the last sequence, and I can talk about all of that during discussion or during Q&A in greater depth. In the last sequence, Wu's voice reflects on the general experience of wildness. At this point, the party's over. The club is still going strong, but the party's over. Sorry. Time management has always been my issue. In the last sequence, Wu's voice reflects on the general experience of wildness. And this is Wu. Throughout the film, I think you saw a little bit of in the clip, but the two voices of the bar as narrator and as Wu, the filmmaker, as narrator, are heard. And Wu says, "I thought that wildness was about trying to create a movement. I didn't realize until it was over that we were already part of one. It just didn't fit with the stories we were told of what we were fighting for." Again, the voice of the silver platter is Wu's respondent. "How can you capture a story that is full of life and constantly evolving?" Wu continues, "There we were. What we were doing was complicated and flawed, but there was something real there. I could feel it." The silver platter, "Son, the friendship and dialogues flourish. There was something real there, damaged, imperfect, and beautiful." The realization that the filmmaker arrives at, that he has not created a movement, but was simply part of one, is the salient point. Wildness, with all its complexity and flaws, was part of a larger trajectory, of an encounter that mattered and continues to matter, because it's part of the very matter that composes the Brown Commons, and all the rich possibility it contains. Brown Commons are not made. One does not bring them into being. Instead, we become attuned to them, and that attunement, not unlike Wu's discovery that he was not starting a movement, but instead squarely within one. Wildness is part of the story of the hubris of a young activist, the hubris that motivates a young queer activist to attempt to touch a queer or trans history despite the various obstacles making any connections. The film's final scene makes clear that this touch can never be about attempting to master or fuse scenes, but instead let the mysteries between us not function as barriers to realizing one's commonness, but instead to know them as the allure that permits us to realize that one is not starting anything, but instead fortunate enough to be a participant in something vaster, something common. Thank you.